Somerset, September 1815. The introduction had been engineered by Mrs. Dalworth, which meant it had been engineered with the quiet ruthlessness of a woman who believed that marriages were infrastructure and ought to be planned accordingly. The Duke of Ashcombe required a wife. His finances were sound, his reputation was intact, but his household had been without a duchess for 4 years, and the county had begun to talk in the way counties talk when a man of significant title remains unmarried, past the point of reason. The Renly family had a daughter, educated beyond what was strictly fashionable, possessed of a moderate fortune and an immoderate mind, and currently unattached for reasons Mrs. Dalworth attributed to the general failure of the men in 3 counties to recognize quality when it was presented to them. She had written to both families in August. She had received cautious agreement from both. She had not, it should be noted, described either party to the other with complete accuracy. Severin Renly arrived at Ashcairn Hall on a Wednesday morning in the 3rd week of September, accompanied by her uncle and the steady composure of a woman who had been the most interesting person in every room she had entered since she was 14, and had learned to carry this as a fact rather than a performance. She wore a dress of deep amber, well made, the kind of thing that communicated taste without announcing effort, though the effort had been considerable, and she saw no purpose in pretending otherwise. She had her uncle's pragmatism in her thinking, and her late mother's precision in her posture, and she sat in the morning room of Ashcairn Hall, with a cup of tea she had not been offered, but had requested, and waited for the Duke of Ashcairn to appear. He appeared at 10:30. He was younger than she had prepared for, and more contained than she had been led to expect, which was the first surprise. The second surprise was the stillness. Not calm precisely, but the quality of a man who had constructed a version of himself for public use, and had been inhabiting it so long he had nearly forgotten it was a construction. He moved through the doorway with the economy of someone who owned every room he entered, and had stopped noticing that he did. "Miss Renly," he said. "Your Grace," she said. Her uncle and Mrs. Dalworth had arranged themselves near the window with the practiced transparency of 2 people who believed their presence was merely decorative. The Duke glanced at this arrangement, then at her, and said with the directness of a man who found social preamble wasteful, "I prefer plain conversation to performance. Shall we speak alone?" They were shown to his study. It was a good study. She noted this with the automatic attention she brought to rooms and to books, and to the particular way a person organized their private space, because private spaces told truths that public ones were designed to conceal. The shelves held books in 4 languages that she could see from where she sat: English, French, Latin, and what appeared to be German, though the spines were turned, and she could not confirm it without standing, which she was not going to do. The books had been read. Several had paper markers between pages. He was not a man who collected volumes for the look of them, which was, she thought, worth noting. She sat. He sat across from her. He regarded her with the focused, unhurried attention of a man conducting an evaluation, which was, she understood with perfect clarity, precisely what this was. "I will be direct," he said. "I would prefer it," she said. "I am in need of a wife," he said. "My requirements are specific. I need a woman of respectable family who is capable of managing a household of considerable size and representing the Ashcairn name in society. I need a woman who understands the obligations of the position and who will conduct herself with the discretion and the dignity the title demands." He paused. His gaze did not waver. "I have no interest in a wife who imagines the role to be something other than what it is. The Duchess of Ashcairn is a position of responsibility, not a stage for personal ambition or intellectual display." The word display did the work he had designed it to do. In another conversation, it might have been neutral. In this one, delivered with his particular pause and his particular gaze, it meant he had been told something about her, and had already decided what it signified. Severin looked at him across the study. She looked at the set of his jaw, and the careful architecture of his stillness, and the way he had chosen, and then reconsidered his phrasing. And she understood, with the precision she brought to all languages, including the unspoken ones, that the weight in his sentence was not about her at all. "You have been disappointed before," she said. Something shifted behind his expression. A door closing. "That is not the subject of this conversation." "It is entirely the subject of this conversation," she said, "though I understand why you would prefer it were not." The silence that followed had texture. She could feel him recalculating, adjusting the assessment he had walked in with, not revising it, not yet, but acknowledging for the first time that the person across from him was not going to fit inside it without alteration. "Mrs. Dalworth mentioned that you have certain accomplishments," he said, and the word accomplishments carried the same freight that display had carried, the dismissal dressed as politeness. "Languages, I believe," she said. "7, Severin said. He looked at her. "I speak 7 languages, Your Grace," she said. "English, French, Italian, German, Portuguese, Latin, and Greek. I read in all 7. I correspond in 5. I have translated diplomatic correspondence from my uncle's trade offices in Lisbon and Hamburg since I was 17, and I have negotiated contracts in 4 of those languages on his behalf since I was 19. She held his gaze. "These are not accomplishments. They are competencies. The distinction matters, and I am surprised that a man with German philosophy on his shelves does not observe it." The Duke of Ashcairn looked at her. He looked at her for a long moment, in which neither of them moved, and the study was very quiet, and the September light came through the tall windows and fell across the desk between them. He said nothing. She had expected argument. She had expected the polished dismissal of a man defending a position he had prepared in advance. She had not expected silence, and the silence told her something the argument would not have. It told her that he had heard her, and that hearing her had cost him something, and that the cost was not something he was willing to let her see. She waited. He did not speak. "Thank you for your candor, Your Grace," she said. She rose. He looked up. The silence broke against her, standing the way water breaks against a stone, and for one unguarded moment, she saw surprise in his face. Genuine surprise. The kind that belongs to a man who has conducted many interviews and has never had the other party end one before he was finished. She did not curtsy. She did not incline her head. She spoke to him in French, one sentence, delivered with the unhurried fluency of a woman who had been thinking in that language since she was 11 and did not require preparation to use it as an instrument. "On ne peut pas évaluer ce que l'on refuse de voir." One cannot assess what one refuses to see. She held the French in the air between them for exactly long enough, and then she turned and left the study and collected her uncle from the morning room with the efficient calm of a woman whose business was concluded, and was in the carriage before Mrs. Dalworth had fully registered that the interview had ended 20 minutes ahead of schedule. Her uncle, who had spent 30 years in international trade and had developed the habit of reading situations the way other men read newspapers, said nothing until they had cleared the Ashcairn gates, and the hall was behind them in the September afternoon. "Well," he said, "he requires a function," Severin said. "He does not require a mind." Her uncle was quiet for a moment. "The man has had difficulties, Severin. Lady Ashcairn was—" "I know what Lady Ashcairn was," she said. "I also know what I am. And I am not a remedy prescribed to treat another woman's diagnosis." Her uncle looked out the window at the Somerset Hills, moving past in the late September light. "What will you do?" She looked at the road ahead. She had been considering it since the moment he had said the word display, which was before the silence, which was before the French, which meant she had been considering it for approximately 12 minutes, and had already arrived at a conclusion. "There is a translation post," she said. "An appointment with the Foreign Office liaison in Bath. The position manages correspondence between the Western trading ports and the diplomatic offices in Lisbon, Hamburg, and Naples. It has been vacant for 3 months because the last holder spoke only French and English and could not manage the Portuguese trade documents. Her uncle turned from the window. That is a government appointment. It is a civil appointment attached to the Trade Commission, she said. It is salaried, it is substantive, and it requires fluency in a minimum of 4 languages. The offices are located on Harford Street in Bath, which is 20 minutes by carriage from Ashcairn Hall. Her uncle looked at her with the expression of a man who had been paying close attention to this particular person since she was 12, and who recognized the precise quality of her voice when a decision had been made and was no longer available for discussion. 20 minutes, he said. The location is convenient, she said. Severin. It is an excellent professional opportunity, uncle. The proximity is incidental. He looked at her. She looked at the road. Neither of them believed the proximity was incidental, and neither of them said so. And the carriage continued through the Somerset countryside in the September light, and Severin thought about a study with books in 4 languages, and a man who had handed her a dismissal wrapped in the language of requirements, and had then gone silent when she unwrapped it. She almost believed the appointment was entirely about the work. The translation post was secured in October, which was faster than most government appointments in Somerset, because Severin Renly had her uncle's connections and her own credentials, and the determination of a woman who had decided something and considered delay and inefficiency. The Foreign Office liaison, a man named Harkness, who had been managing the Western trade correspondence with 2 translators and his own limited French for the better part of a year, received her application on a Tuesday and offered her the position by Thursday, having tested her in 4 languages during the interview, and found himself, for the first time in 11 months, in possession of a staff member who could actually read the documents arriving from Lisbon without requiring a secondary translation from the Portuguese consul, who charged by the page and was slow about it. The Duke of Ashcairn was informed of the appointment by Mrs. Dalworth, who mentioned it during a Sunday call at Ashcairn Hall in the manner of a woman delivering intelligence while presenting it as gossip. Miss Renly, the Duke said. He set down his correspondence. She has taken the translation post at the Trade Commission in Bath, Mrs. Dalworth said. The Foreign Office appointment. Languages, of course. She is apparently quite indispensable already. Mr. Harkness has not had a properly translated Portuguese shipping manifest in over a year, and Miss Renly produced 4 in her first week. The Duke looked at the window that faced east, toward Bath, toward the Trade Commission offices on Harford Street, that were, as he was aware, without having calculated it, approximately 20 minutes by carriage from where he was sitting. The Trade Commission, he said. Yes, Your Grace. The Correspondence Office. She manages the translation work for the Lisbon and Hamburg dispatches. And Naples, I believe, though I may have the Italian arrangements confused. The Duke was quiet for a moment. She speaks Italian as well. 7 languages, I am told, Mrs. Dalworth said, with the carefully calibrated tone of a woman who was repeating information the Duke already possessed and wanted him to know she knew he possessed it. Though I confess I cannot name them all. English, French, Italian, German, Portuguese, Latin, and Greek, the Duke said, and then stopped, because he had listed them from memory, and the listing revealed more than he had intended. Mrs. Dalworth looked at him. She said nothing. She did not need to. The Duke returned to his correspondence, and Mrs. Dalworth accepted a second cup of tea, and neither of them mentioned Miss Renly again that afternoon. But the Duke's pen did not move for some time after the conversation ended, and the letter he had been writing remained unfinished until the following morning. Severin began work at the Trade Commission on the first Monday of November, which was not the fashionable time to take up a professional appointment in Bath. November being the month when society retreated to country estates and closed its doors against the cold and the diminishing social calendar. But Severin had not come to Bath for society. She had come for the work, which was considerable and absorbing, and exactly the kind of thing she was built for. The commission offices on Harford Street occupied the second floor of a stone building overlooking the river, and the correspondence room where she worked had tall windows that let in the gray November light, and a desk that was, within a week, entirely covered in documents. Portuguese trade manifests from Lisbon, German shipping contracts from Hamburg, Italian diplomatic notes from Naples that required not merely translation, but interpretation, because the Neapolitan attaché wrote in a dialect that was 3 parts formal Italian and 1 part deliberate obfuscation, and Severin found this privately entertaining and professionally useful. She spent the first 2 weeks learning the systems, reading every document in the archive, and correcting the gaps where her predecessors had approximated rather than translated. There were errors, significant ones. A Portuguese trade agreement from March had been translated with a clause that reversed the liability terms, and no one had noticed because no one in the office read Portuguese with sufficient precision to catch a subjunctive where an indicative should have been. She caught it. She corrected it. She wrote a memorandum to Harkness, explaining the error in language that was precise and diplomatic, and did not once use the word incompetent, though the word was available to her and would have been accurate. Harkness read the memorandum twice. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had just discovered that the person he had hired to translate documents was also capable of understanding them. "You found this in the March archive," he said. "I found this and 6 others," she said. "I have prepared corrections for all of them. 3 require letters to the Lisbon office. 2 require amendments to the Hamburg contracts. 1 requires a conversation with the Neapolitan attaché that I would prefer to conduct myself, as the error involves a diplomatic nuance that will need to be addressed in Italian and then confirmed in English, and I do not trust the confirmation to survive a third-party translation." Harkness looked at the stack of corrected translations on the corner of her desk that had not been there when he left the office the previous evening. "You did this overnight," he said. "I did this over 2 evenings," she said. "I do not work past 10. Harkness set the memorandum on her desk and left with the slightly dazed expression of a man who had requested a translator and received a department. It was on the 3rd week of November that the Duke of Ashcairn's correspondence arrived at the Trade Commission, not addressed to her. Addressed to Harkness, regarding a shipping matter connected to the Ashcairn estate's timber exports, which were routed through the Bristol Channel and required documentation in English and Portuguese for the Lisbon receiving office. The matter was routine. The correspondence was formal. The fact that the Duke of Ashcairn had previously handled his timber documentation through his own estate solicitor and had never once directed a query to the Trade Commission was a detail that Severin noted and set aside and did not examine too closely. Harkness brought the correspondence to her because it involved Portuguese translation, which was her area, and because Harkness had developed in 3 weeks the habit of bringing everything to her, because she was, in his emerging understanding, the person in the office who made things work. She read the Duke's letter. She read it with the professional attention she brought to all correspondence, and then she read it again with a different kind of attention, the kind that noticed that his handwriting was precise and unhurried, and that his phrasing was direct, and that he had used 1 word, a specific Portuguese trade term, correctly, which meant he had either looked it up or had known it, and either possibility told her something. She translated the relevant documents. She prepared the response for Harkness's signature. She did not add a personal note. She let the work speak, because the work had always been the language she trusted most, and if he was listening, he would hear it. His reply arrived the following Tuesday, faster than Trade Commission correspondence typically moved, again addressed to Harkness, again involving a matter that could have been handled by his estate solicitor. This time, he included a question about the Portuguese tariff schedule that was specific enough to require genuine expertise and general enough to require a detailed written answer. Severin prepared the answer. It was thorough and precise, and 3 pages longer than strictly necessary, because the question opened onto a broader issue of tariff classification that she thought he should understand if he was going to continue exporting timber through the Lisbon route, and she was not going to provide a partial answer to a question that deserved a complete one. Harkness signed the response. He did not ask why the Duke of Ashcairn's routine timber query had received a more comprehensive answer than any other correspondence that month. He had learned in 4 weeks that questioning Severin's professional judgments was both unnecessary and unwise. The Duke's third letter arrived the following week. This one was addressed to Harkness, but the final line read, "Please extend my regards to your Portuguese translator, whose work on the tariff memorandum was exceptional." Severin read this line. She read it once. She set the letter on her desk and looked at the November rain on the Harford Street windows and thought about a man who had told her that the Duchess of Ashcairn was not a stage for intellectual display, and who was now sending compliments through official channels to the woman whose intellect he had dismissed, using the bureaucratic equivalent of a note passed in church. She did not smile. She did not allow herself the satisfaction, not yet. Not while the rain was watching, and the office was full, and the work was waiting. She picked up the next document, a shipping manifest from Hamburg, and translated it with the same precision she brought to everything. And the November afternoon continued, and she thought about the word exceptional and what it meant when a duke used it about a woman he had declined to see clearly. And she found the word interesting, and the thinking useful, and the work, as always, sufficient. The fourth letter did not come through the post. It came in person. He arrived at the Trade Commission on the last Monday of November, unannounced, on a matter he described to Harkness as urgent, involving a discrepancy in the Lisbon timber contracts. Harkness showed him to the correspondence room, which was Severin's room, which was where she was sitting when the door opened, and the Duke of Ashcairn walked through it. She looked up from a Neapolitan trade dispatch she had been annotating in the margins, in 3 languages simultaneously. "Your Grace," she said. "Miss Renly," he said. He looked at her desk. He looked at the documents covering it, the neat stacks of translated correspondence, the tariff memorandum she had written for him, still open as a reference, which told him the work had been thorough enough to become a standard. He looked at the annotations in her margins. She watched him follow the Italian into the Portuguese, into the English, watched him recognize that she was not merely translating, but interpreting, building something from the raw correspondence that had not existed before she arrived. "The timber discrepancy," she said. "You mentioned it to Mr. Harkness." "Yes," he said. He was still looking at her desk. "There is no discrepancy," she said. "The Lisbon office uses a classification system that differs from the Bristol standard. The numbers appear contradictory, but resolve when you read the Portuguese headers, which specify a different unit of measurement. Your previous translator was converting the figures directly, which produced an apparent shortfall that does not exist." He looked at her. "You identified this from the correspondence." "I identified this from the first letter you sent," she said. "I included the correction in the tariff memorandum. Page 7, 3rd paragraph. The footnote explains the conversion." The Duke was quiet. He had the expression of a man who had come prepared to discuss a problem and had discovered the problem had been solved before he arrived, and the solution had been available to him for 2 weeks in a document he had apparently not read to page 7. "I see," he said. "The memorandum was comprehensive," she said. "I would recommend reading it in full." Something happened at the corner of his mouth, not a smile, the precursor to one, suppressed with the practiced control of a man who did not permit himself unguarded expressions in professional settings. But she saw it. She catalogued it. She set it beside the word exceptional, and the 4 letters, and the fact that he had come in person to a government office to discuss a discrepancy that did not exist, and she began to understand the shape of what was happening. "Thank you, Miss Renly," he said. "The work is exceptional." "You have used that word before, Your Grace," she said. "It remains accurate," he said. He held her gaze for a moment that was 1 beat longer than the professional register required. Then he inclined his head and left the correspondence room, and she heard him exchange brief courtesies with Harkness in the corridor, and then the commission door closed, and he was gone. She sat at her desk in the November light and thought about a man who had told her she was not needed for her mind, and had traveled to Bath to consult it. She thought about the almost smile, and about the tariff memorandum, and about the particular quality of his attention when he looked at her desk, the way he had read the room, the way she read rooms, looking for what was true about the person who occupied it. She thought about the study at Ashcairn Hall, and the man who had sat across from her and refused to see what was in front of him. He's beginning to see it now. She picked up the Neapolitan Dispatch and returned to her annotations, and the November afternoon continued on Harford Street, and she did not think about the almost smile for the rest of the day, with moderate success. December brought the winter social season in Somerset. The same families rotated through the same drawing rooms, with the accumulated precision of people who had elevated the ritual to something between tradition and surveillance. Severin had been received into the circuit through Mrs. Dalworth, who introduced her at the Pemberley dinner with the casual authority of a woman who considered introductions a form of infrastructure investment. The county had taken note. A woman of moderate fortune and no title, working at the Trade Commission, attending county dinners as though she belonged at them. Somerset was not certain what to make of this. It was certain that it was interested. She and the Duke were at the same dinner twice in December. The first was at the Cavendish House, a formal affair for 20, at which they were seated at the same end of the table and spoke exactly once, a brief exchange about the Portuguese tariff revisions that was overheard by Mrs. Cavendish and immediately became the most discussed moment of the evening, not for its content, but for the particular quality of attention the Duke had directed at Miss Renly during it, which 3 women and 1 very observant footman had independently noted. The second dinner was at Ashcairn Hall itself, a winter supper for 16. Severin was seated 4 places from him, between Sir Aldous Crewe, who was 60 and deaf in one ear and charming about it, and a young clergyman who spent the first course explaining the etymology of 3 English words she already knew the etymology of in 5 languages, and she was too polite to say so. She was aware, throughout the dinner, that the Duke was listening, not to her conversation with Sir Aldous, which was about the Somerset Canal system, and was genuinely interesting, but to her, to the way she managed the table around her, the way she drew Sir Aldous out on the canal question, and redirected the clergyman toward a subject he actually knew something about, the way she moved through the evening with the practiced ease of a woman who understood that a dinner table was a negotiation conducted with cutlery. She knew he was listening because she had developed, over 2 months of correspondence and 2 dinners and 1 visit to her office, a working sense of where his attention was, the way a translator develops a sense for the structure of a language before she can articulate the grammar. She could feel it the way she felt the shift between Portuguese and Italian, a change in register, a redirection of weight. At the end of the Ashcairn dinner in the entrance hall, while carriages were called and coats were retrieved, Mrs. Dalworth appeared beside her with the quiet inevitability of a woman who had been waiting for precisely this moment. "You managed Sir Aldous beautifully," Mrs. Dalworth said. "Sir Aldous is well informed about canals," Severin said. "Sir Aldous is well informed about canals and entirely uninformed about everything else, which makes him useful at dinner and exhausting at breakfast," Mrs. Dalworth said. She looked across the entrance hall at the Duke, who was saying good night to the last of his guests, with the formal economy of a host whose evening was concluded. "He watches you." "He watches everyone," Severin said. "It is the habit of a man who manages a room." "He manages rooms," Mrs. Dalworth said. "He watches you. The distinction matters." She paused. "I believe you once said something similar to him about the distinction between accomplishments and competencies." Severin looked at her gloves. "I am aware of the history," she said carefully. "Lady Ashcairn." "The history," Mrs. Dalworth said, "is a failure that he has been wearing as armor. Armor can be removed." She paused. with the right instrument. Mrs. Dalworth, Severin said, with the composed directness that was her natural register. I took the translation post as a professional appointment. Of course you did, Mrs. Dalworth said, with the serenity of a woman who had heard variations of this statement from 2 different people in the same month and had formed her own conclusions about both. Good evening, Miss Renly. January brought the coldest weather Somerset had seen in 3 years, and with it, a crisis. The Lisbon Trade Office had sent an urgent dispatch, written in Portuguese with annotations in Italian, regarding a tariff dispute between British trading interests and the Portuguese Customs Authority. A shipment of Somerset wool had been held at the Lisbon docks for 6 weeks over a classification disagreement, and the documentation had been escalating in hostility for a month, and no one in the Western Trade Commission had been able to resolve it, because no one could read the Portuguese legal citations the Customs Authority was using to justify the hold. No one except Severin. Harkness brought her the dispatch on a Tuesday morning with the expression of a man delivering a problem he had been losing sleep over. She read it in 11 minutes. She identified the legal issue in 14. The Portuguese Customs Authority was citing a tariff code from 1812 that had been superseded by a bilateral amendment in 1814, and the amendment had never been translated into English because the previous translator had not read Portuguese legal documents, and the Lisbon office had not thought to flag the discrepancy because the Lisbon office assumed that London knew what its own trade agreements contained, which was, Severin thought, an optimistic assumption about any government. She drafted a response in Portuguese. She drafted a companion letter in English for Harkness. She drafted a 3rd document, a memorandum to the Foreign Office liaison in London, explaining the broader implications of the tariff misclassification and recommending a systematic review of all Portuguese trade codes adopted since 1812. Harkness read all 3 documents. He set them on his desk and looked at her with the expression she had seen on his face before, the one that meant he was recalibrating his understanding of the person he had hired. This resolves the wool shipment, he said. This resolves the wool shipment, prevents the next 3 disputes of the same kind, and establishes a precedent for how the Commission handles Portuguese legal citations going forward, she said. The memorandum to London is optional, but advisable. If they adopt the recommendation, it will save the Western Commission approximately 40 hours of translation work per quarter. Harkness was quiet for a moment. I will send all 3, he said. The documents went to Lisbon and London on the same post. The wool shipment was released within 2 weeks. The Foreign Office liaison in London wrote back to Harkness with a note that was, by the standards of government correspondence, effusive, and which included the sentence, "The clarity of the Portuguese legal analysis suggests expertise that the Western Commission has not previously demonstrated." Harkness showed her the letter. She read it once. "They are complimenting you," she said. "They are complimenting you," Harkness said. "I am merely the signature." The resolution of the Lisbon dispute traveled through Somerset, the way professional accomplishments travel through a county that pays attention. It reached the Duke through Mrs. Dalworth at a Thursday call, through Sir Aldous at a Friday supper, and through his own steward during the weekly estate review, because the Ashcairn timber exports used the same Lisbon route and the same tariff codes Severin had corrected. The Duke listened to his steward's account of the matter. He asked 2 questions. The first was about the tariff codes. The second was about the memorandum to London. "Miss Renly drafted it," the steward said. The Duke was quiet for a moment. He looked at the estate ledger in front of him. He looked at the timber export figures. He looked at the south window that faced toward Bath, toward the Trade Commission, toward the correspondence room on Harford Street, where a woman he had told was not needed, for her mind had just resolved a diplomatic crisis that 3 government offices had failed to manage. "Have the timber documentation reviewed," he said, "against the corrected tariff codes." "Yes, Your Grace. Shall I contact the Trade Commission?" "I will handle it," the Duke said. The winter assembly at the Cavendish House was the largest gathering of the Somerset season. 50 people, the full county, the annual event that served as both social occasion and informal census, a way for the county to confirm who it was and who belonged to it, and who was still under consideration. Severin arrived with Mrs. Dalworth, who had developed the practice of collecting her from the Harford Street rooms before these events, without either of them having formally discussed the arrangement, which was Mrs. Dalworth's preferred method of making things permanent, without the inconvenience of agreement. The Duke was there. He was across the room when she entered, in conversation with Sir Aldous, and 2 men she recognized from the Ashcairn dinner, and he looked up when she arrived, and the quality of his attention was the one she had stopped pretending not to notice. The evening unfolded, as these evenings did. The circuits of the room, the overlapping conversations, the careful social choreography of 50 people managing their reputations in a shared space. She talked about the canal system with the Cavendishes. She talked about the Lisbon resolution with Harkness, who had been invited because the Cavendish family had wool interests. She talked about crop rotation with 2 landowners who were surprised that a woman at a trade commission understood agriculture, and she did not explain that she understood it in 4 languages, because the explanation was longer than the conversation warranted. She was in the middle of this circuit when she became aware of Lord Berwick. She had noticed him earlier in the evening, a baronet, late 40s, who carried the permanent expression of a man whose opinions had never been tested and whose position had never been questioned. He had been at the Ashcairn dinner in December and at the Cavendish dinner before that. Each time, he had watched her from across the room with the particular attention of a man assembling a judgment he intended to deliver when the audience was right. The audience was right now. Miss Renly, Lord Berwick said, positioning himself at her left during a pause in the conversation. 4 other people were close enough to catch the exchange. He had chosen his moment. The Lisbon affair, he said with a smile that included the room. Quite the achievement for the Trade Commission. One hears that the resolution was managed entirely through translated correspondence. He paused. Remarkable that a woman of, shall we say, linguistic enthusiasm should find herself at the center of a diplomatic matter. She looked at him. The word enthusiasm performed the same function the display had performed in the Duke's study. It was the diminishment dressed as compliment, the reduction of competence to hobby, delivered with a smile and an audience, and the confidence of a man who had never been contradicted by anyone who mattered. One does wonder, he continued, whether the Commission's reliance on a single translator, however talented, reflects a strength or a, shall we say, a vulnerability in the system. Expertise is admirable, of course, but institutional dependence on one person's particular skills can suggest a certain fragility in the apparatus. The word fragility carried his real meaning, not the Commission's fragility. Hers. The fragility of a woman without title or husband or institutional protection who had placed herself at the center of something important and could, he was suggesting, be removed from it as easily as she had been inserted. She was composing her response, the precise, measured, devastating response she had been formulating since the word enthusiasm, when she heard the Duke's voice. The Lisbon resolution, the Duke said from her right, in a register she had not heard before, not the study voice, not the dinner voice, not the correspondence voice, but the one that lived beneath all of them, the one that carried the weight of a title that had been in Somerset since the 16th century, and knew exactly what that weight could do when it was applied. The Lisbon resolution saved the Western Trade Commission 6 weeks of escalation and prevented a tariff misclassification that would have affected every British export routed through the Portuguese Customs Authority, including the Ashcairn timber contracts. He looked at Lord Berwick with the focused, unhurried attention that she had first encountered in the study, and that was now directed at someone else entirely. The memorandum that accompanied the resolution has been adopted by the Foreign Office as a reference standard for Portuguese trade law. I know this because I received confirmation of it this week in my own correspondence. He paused. The room was very quiet. The system is not fragile, Lord Berwick, The system, for the first time in 3 years, is functioning. I would suggest that anyone familiar with the Commission's output since November would know the difference. Lord Berwick's smile underwent a rapid and visible recalibration. Of course, the county, the Duke said, with the economy of a man who did not require volume because he had never needed it. Benefits from expertise supplied seriously. I believe we are all agreed on that. He looked at Lord Berwick for 1 moment longer than was necessary. Then he returned to the conversation he had been in, as though nothing had occurred, and Lord Berwick found someone else to speak with the controlled haste of a man who had been corrected in public by the only person in the room whose correction could not be returned. Severin stood beside the Duke in the aftermath. She thought about what had just happened with the precision she brought to all important information. He had not made her a cause or a project. He had inserted accurate, verifiable information into a room that was being given a false impression, and had done it in a way that left her standing as a professional rather than as a woman being defended. She thought he knows what he has done. She thought he is waiting to see what I do with it. She excused herself and crossed the room to Mrs. Dalworth, who looked at her expression, and then at the Duke across the room, and then back at her expression. Well, Mrs. Dalworth said. He intervened, Severin said. I saw. He did not have to. No, Mrs. Dalworth said. She accepted a glass of wine with the composure of a woman who had been waiting for this conversation for 3 months. Lord Berwick will be measured for the rest of the season, which is useful for everyone. Severin looked across the room at the Duke, who was in conversation, and was not looking at her. He cited the Foreign Office adoption, she said. He made it about the work. He made it about the work, Mrs. Dalworth agreed, so that Berwick had no path forward, so that the room understood the position without requiring a declaration, and so that you were defended without being diminished. She paused. Which requires a very specific understanding of who you are and what matters to you. Severin held her glass. He was wrong about me, she said. In the study. Yes, Mrs. Dalworth said, and he has known it for some time. She looked at the Duke across the room. He is a man who revises slowly but thoroughly. When the revision is complete, it is permanent. Severin thought about the French sentence in the study. On ne peut pas évaluer ce que l'on refuse de voir. One cannot assess what one refuses to see. She thought about the version of herself who had delivered it, and the version of herself standing in this room 3 months later with a wine glass and a diplomatic resolution and a county that was beginning to understand what she was. She looked across the room at the Duke. He looked back. Not the assessing attention. The other one. The one she had stopped pretending not to catalog. She held his gaze for 1 moment, 1 beat longer than the social register required, and then turned back to Mrs. Dalworth and said something about the canal bill, and the assembly continued around them, and neither of them said anything further that evening, and it cost them both considerably. He called at the Trade Commission on a Monday morning, 4 days after the assembly, which was soon enough to mean it had been decided before the assembly ended. She was at her desk when Harkness showed him in, working on a German shipping contract that required cross-referencing against 3 separate tariff classifications, and she did not rearrange her papers or her expression because she had stopped arranging herself for his benefit sometime in November and was not going to resume the practice. Your Grace, she said. Miss Renly. He looked at the room that was hers in every way that mattered. I came to discuss the timber documentation. The timber documentation is complete, she said. I sent the corrected filings to your steward last week. I know, he said. I have read them, including page 7. Something moved between them. Not the precursor to a smile this time, but the acknowledgement that page 7 had become a reference point, a private language built from a professional exchange, and both of them understood what it meant. I owe you an explanation, he said. She waited. In the study, he said. In September. What I said to you about display and about the role of a duchess was not. He paused. He was looking at the window rather than at her, which was the only sign that this was costing him something. It was not about you. It was about Lady Ashcairn. I know, she said. He looked at her. I understood in the study, she said. That is why I left in French. Not because you dismissed me, though you did, but because I understood that you were not evaluating me at all. You were defending yourself against a repetition that I had not committed and wasn't going to commit. He was quiet for a long moment. Your wife, Severin said. She was intelligent. She was brilliant, the Duke said, and the word carried 4 years of weight. She was the most intellectually gifted woman I had ever met, and she used every capacity she had to dismantle everything I built, and most of what I was. She conducted her intelligence the way other people conduct warfare. By the time she left, I had concluded that a woman's mind was something to be survived rather than valued. He looked at the window. I brought that conclusion into the study in September and presented it to you as a requirement. I called it discretion. I called it dignity. It was neither. It was fear. Severin looked at the man across her desk who had walked into a study with a wound dressed as a policy, and had just named the wound without flinching. I am not Lady Ashcairn, she said. I know, he said. I have known it since the tariff memorandum. That is a very specific moment to have identified the distinction. It was a very specific memorandum, he said. Page 7 made a case for Portuguese tariff reform that was more rigorous than any argument my estate solicitor has produced in 10 years. It was also clear and useful and offered without performance. That was the distinction. Lady Ashcairn's intelligence was a weapon. Yours is a language. She looked at him. She thought about a man who had spent 4 years wearing his failure as armor, and had just taken the armor off in a government office on Harford Street on a Monday morning. And she thought about what it cost to do that, and what it meant that he had chosen to do it here, at her desk, in her room, where the work was. The French, she said, in the study. When I left. On ne peut pas évaluer ce que l'on refuse de voir, he said. She stared at him. You remembered it, she said. I translated it that evening, he said. My French is adequate for philosophy, but insufficient for insults delivered at speed. I required a dictionary. You were correct, he said. I was refusing to see. I have since looked. She held his gaze across the desk covered in German shipping contracts and Portuguese tariff codes and the accumulated evidence of 3 months of work that had been, she could now admit, never entirely about the work. And what do you see? She said. I see a woman who speaks 7 languages, he said, and who has been speaking an 8th one to me since September, and I have only recently become fluent enough to hear it. The Monday morning continued on Harford Street. The commission offices were quiet. The German contract was on the desk between them, and the window showed the winter sky over Bath, and neither of them moved, and the moment held itself with the precision of a sentence, in a language they were both still learning to speak. She did not speak to him in French. She did not speak to him in any of the 7 languages she had catalogued and deployed and used as instruments, and as shields, and as the evidence of who she was. She spoke to him in the 8th one. You are not too late, she said. He reached across the desk. He took her hand, the hand that held the pen, the hand that had translated the tariff memorandum and the Lisbon dispatch and the French sentence that had started everything. He held it with the grip of a man who had spent 4 years holding nothing and had decided he was finished with the practice. Severin, he said. Her name. Not Miss Renly, not the professional register. Her name, spoken in his voice for the first time, and it carried all of September, and October, and November, and December, and January in it, and none of it was armor anymore. William, she said, because she had learned his name from Mrs. Dalworth and had been carrying it since October without using it, and had decided that this was the morning it was needed. He kissed her. It was not hesitant. It had the directness of a man who had spent 4 months revising a position and had arrived at a conclusion he was prepared to act on. She kissed him back with the same precision she brought to contracts and translations and every true thing she had ever decided, and the office was quiet, and the winter morning continued on Harford Street, and none of it required further translation. When they separated, she kept her hand in his. "The timber documentation," she said, "is complete," he said. "I have been thorough this time." "You came to discuss the timber documentation." "I came to discuss the timber documentation," he agreed. "The timber documentation has been discussed." "Has it?" "The relevant matters have been addressed," he said. "I believe we have moved to supplementary items." She looked at him. He looked at her. The corner of his mouth did the thing she had catalogued at the first visit, and was now permitted to acknowledge she had been cataloguing. "You are going to be very difficult to manage," he said. "I have 7 languages," she said. "I am difficult to manage in all of them." "I am aware," he said. "I have been compiling evidence." "Is this a proposal?" "This is a preliminary finding," he said. "Based on extensive correspondence, 1 in-person consultation, 2 dinner observations, 1 public intervention, and a tariff memorandum that I should have read to page 7 considerably sooner than I did. That is a thorough basis for a finding." "I am thorough," he said, "when the subject warrants it." She looked at him. She thought about a man who had walked into a study with a policy built from a wound and had spent 4 months having the policy dismantled by tariff codes and diplomatic dispatches, and a woman who knew what her competencies were and had deployed them from a desk on Harford Street. "The finding is accepted," she said, "pending formal review." "The formal review," he said, "will require a longer conversation than a Monday morning at the Trade Commission allows." "Then you should come to dinner," she said. "Thursday. My room's on Harford Street. I will not serve you tea in the drawing room because I do not have a drawing room. I have a desk and a dining table that seats 4. "Thursday," he said. 7 o'clock. 7 o'clock, she confirmed. He released her hand. He looked at her for one more moment with the full, undefended attention, the one that had nothing of September in it, and then he inclined his head and left, and the commission door closed behind him, and Severin sat at her desk and looked at the German contract and found that she could not read it, which had never happened before, and was, she concluded, an acceptable temporary condition. The engagement was settled by the end of February, which surprised no one who had been paying attention and several people who had not. He had asked formally on a Thursday evening at her Harford Street rooms over a dinner she had cooked herself because she did not have a cook and did not consider this a deficiency, and she had said yes with the same directness, and they had regarded each other across a table that seated 4 with the mutual recognition of 2 people who had arrived at the same conclusion from opposite directions, and were pleased to find the conclusions matched. Her uncle received the news with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had watched his niece take a translation post 20 minutes from a duke's estate, and had understood precisely what she was doing. "The Duke of Ashcairn," he said, "the man who had no interest in intellectual display." "He has revised that position considerably," she said. "He read the tariff memorandum to page 7. He translated the French I said to him in September using a dictionary. He told me that my intelligence was a language, not a weapon." She paused. "I find I cannot hold a man's September against him when his January is everything it should be." Her uncle set down his correspondence. "Is he good enough for you?" She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything. "He is learning to be," she said. "That is the best version of the answer, and the only honest one." Her uncle nodded. He wrote to the Duke that afternoon, a letter that was brief and direct, and contained the details of the Renly accounts, stated without embellishment. The Duke's reply arrived the following morning. It was addressed to Severin, not to her uncle. It said, "Your uncle's letter was generous and entirely beside the point. I am not marrying a fortune. I am marrying a translator who will read my correspondence in 7 languages and tell me when I have failed to reach page 7. W.W. She read this twice. She put it in the desk drawer where she kept important documents. There were 5 letters from the Duke in that drawer now, beginning with the first timber query that had been addressed to Harkness, and ending with this one, which was addressed to her. And the distance between those 2 addresses was the entire story. Mrs. Dalworth called on Wednesday. She arrived at the Harford Street rooms with the energy of a woman who had been exercising restraint for 4 days and had reached its limits. "Well," she said. "Well," Severin agreed. "The correspondence room? He proposed in the correspondence room?" "He proposed at this table," Severin said, "over roast chicken and a conversation about Portuguese maritime law that became a conversation about other things. He was happy when he called on me yesterday," Mrs. Dalworth said. "I have not seen him happy in 4 years. He showed it the way he shows everything, very quietly, and as though it had always been there. But it was new, and I saw it. And I want you to know that I saw it." She looked at Severin steadily. "You are good for him." "He's good for me," Severin said, "which is the thing I did not expect." "What did you expect?" Severin looked at the window, the Harford Street view, the winter sky over Bath, the road that led to Ashcairn Hall. "I expected to prove a point," she said. "I expected to take this post and be brilliant at it, and make it impossible for him to maintain the position he had taken in September. I expected to be right." She paused. "I did not expect to discover that he was also right about certain things, and that the things he was right about were the things that made him worth the argument." "What was he right about?" "That a woman who speaks 7 languages," Severin said, "is a formidable thing." He had entirely the wrong response to it. But the recognition was not wrong. Mrs. Dalworth smiled, not the social smile, the real one, the one that belonged to a woman who had spent 40 years managing Somerset society and occasionally found it genuinely worthwhile. "He is going to discover," Mrs. Dalworth said, "that he has acquired a duchess who will manage his correspondence better than he does." "He has already discovered it," Severin said. "He mentioned it twice during the proposal." "During the proposal." "He described it as a preliminary finding based on extensive evidence. I described the finding as accepted pending formal review. We then discussed the terms." Mrs. Dalworth set down her cup. "He proposed to you using the language of Trade Commission correspondence?" "He proposed to me," Severin said, "in the 8th language, the one we built together. It was the most fluent thing he has ever said to me." Mrs. Dalworth stood with the efficiency of a woman who had received everything she came for. "The engagement dinner," she said. "I will host it, the first week of March. The Cavendishes, the cruise, the county. A full occasion." She paused at the door. "Lord Berwick will be invited." Severin looked at her. "Because," Mrs. Dalworth said, "it is better to have him at the table where he must be gracious than outside it where he will not. And because the sight of Lord Berwick congratulating you on your engagement to the Duke of Ashcairn will be one of the more satisfying things I have witnessed in recent memory, and I am not above enjoying it." Severin looked at her for a moment. "I find I am not above it either," she said. Mrs. Dalworth left. Severin returned to her desk and found that she had been sitting with a Portuguese shipping manifest for 20 minutes without reading a single line, which was unprecedented, and which she attributed to the view from the window, which showed the road to Ashcairn and the February sky and everything she was seeing differently. They were married in April at the church in the village between Bath and Ashcairn, which was geographically convenient and architecturally beautiful, and contained a stone font that had been there since the 13th century, and windows that let in the April light in a way that made the entire building feel like a sentence in a language that did not require translation. She wore deep amber. William had not been surprised. Her uncle had simply nodded when she told him. The county came. 50 people and more beyond them, because the marriage of a duke was an occasion, and the marriage of this duke to this woman was an occasion with the additional quality of a story the county had been following since September. Severin walked in on her uncle's arm and looked at William at the front of the church and thought about the study in September and the man who had told her he had no interest in intellectual display and the French sentence she had given him on her way out of his life. She thought about all the versions of the languages between them. The first, the French exit. I see what you are refusing to see, and I am leaving you to it. The second, the professional register, the tariff memorandums that had spoken for her when she would not speak for herself. The third, the silence at the assembly, when she had held his gaze one beat longer than required, and the nothing had said everything. The fourth, at her desk, when she had spoken in the 8th language, the one they had built from timber documentation and a memorandum he should have read to page 7. She thought about the 5th version. She had thought about where it would happen and what it would mean. She reached the front of the church. William looked at her with the full undefended attention, the expression that had nothing of September in it, nothing of the study evaluation, nothing of the man who had organized his grief into a policy. Just this. Just him, entirely present, looking at the woman who had taken a translation post 20 minutes from his estate and resolved a diplomatic crisis and been right about everything and had chosen him anyway. She took his hand. She leaned close enough that only he could hear her, and she spoke to him in Italian, soft and precise and unhurried, a sentence she had chosen because Italian was the language she loved most and had never used with him before, and she had been saving it. Ti ho scelto in tutte le lingue che conosco, e in quella che abbiamo inventato insieme. I chose you in every language I know, and in the one we invented together. He looked at her. He understood it completely. She saw him understand it, because his Italian was better than his French, and because some things do not require translation when the person hearing them has spent 6 months learning how to listen. Severin, he said, and her name in his voice had all of September and October and November and December and January and February in it. And none of it was armor anymore, and all of it was the 8th language, the one that did not belong to any country and could not be found in any dictionary, and was, she had concluded, the only one that had ever mattered. The April morning went on around them, warm and unhurried, and entirely indifferent to whether any of it had been practical. And the answer they had both arrived at was that it had been, just not in the way she had told herself in September. The best translations, her uncle had always said, were the ones that revealed something in the new language that had been hidden in the original. She understood this one completely.